Hey YouTube, this is Archangel for Truth, and my video for today is talking about Eddie Craig's recommendations for encounters with law enforcement. Now, I believe that the recommendations that Eddie Craig gives are really good, and I highly recommend that everyone should learn them in addressing encounters with law enforcement. But there are some areas which I would recommend that you do a little different than as Eddie Craig has told you. And I'll explain why that is, the logic behind it, and the reasons from a legal standpoint. And so, one of the things that often happens is people, when an officer comes to their window, right away they're going to go to what recommendations Eddie Craig has made to them. And that's fine. But when an officer should require you to exit your vehicle, and I realize that you have all these questions that you want to ask, and I realize that you want to establish that you're not willing to allow that officer to search or seize you. However, it's also very, very, very important for you to understand that the Supreme Court has ruled that officers may, in fact, remove you out of the vehicle for their safety. So what they're going to do is they're going to take you out of the vehicle, they're going to pat you down to search if you have any weapons, and they're going to search your vehicle in the driving area where you're sitting at to see if there are any sort of weapons that could pose a potential threat to their safety. So even though I realize you don't want to exit out of your vehicle, and you certainly should express that you're not giving consent for any searches or seizure, but you're willing to comply to the officer's order to exit the vehicle. It's important that if he asks you to exit the vehicle, that you do so immediately. You do not delay. You may continue to pose your questions to him about the questions that Eddie Craig recommends that you pose to him, but you must do so after complying, or even while you're complying. There's no reason why you can't ask those questions while complying to that order to exit the vehicle. But when you do so, stipulate that you are not agreeing to any sort of searches or seizures. On the record. Now, what I recommend for you, and this is why I'm recommending this, is because the goal of law enforcement is in part for safety, to make sure that you're not a threat to them, but also many in law enforcement, they don't like the idea that you have a camera set up in your vehicle, or you're holding onto a camera or phone, what have you, to record them. They're not going to like that. They're going to want you not to have those things to record them. And you'll see many times officers will use a flashlight and shine that light and right into your camera so you can't capture their image of them. But I recommend, as an alternative, that what you do is you have a voice recording app on your phone and just have that going on and keep that in your pocket. You can certainly advise the officer that you will be recording the encounter for your safety, and but ultimately I would keep that in a way where the officer's not going to perceive it to be as a threat. And so oftentimes officers will take people out of their vehicles, and the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to take that cell phone or camera that's in their hand and put it on the top of the car or what have you. Now you no longer have access to your recording device, and ultimately you don't want to be at any point without that recording device. To the extent possible, you want to record the encounter as much as you possibly can. So, number one, if the officer requires you to exit the vehicle, express yourself that you do not agree to any searches or seizures, but comply. Because we've already seen the results of officers who, because of the authority that they feel that they have, will escalate the situation. They'll escalate it, and we've seen many instances where law enforcement have, in fact, gotten people's windows busted because they weren't complying quick enough for the officer, because they wanted to continue on with their questioning of the officer. So the thing is you don't want to do that. You want to comply as quickly as you possibly can, but still maintain your rights. And so that's just one area that I recommend that you adjust from what Eddie Craig says to you. Yes, ask those questions, and deal with the officers in the way he suggests, but follow that order. If they tell you to exit the vehicle, you need to exit the vehicle. Okay? So that's just one area that I recommend. Now, the second area I recommend is that you do not have your wallet on you, but you have it in your trunk. I would not put it in your glove compartment. I would not put it in any areas that you have, whether it be on the side of the door or anything. You want all your identifying paperwork. It could be your registration, your insurance, what have you. All your paperwork. You don't want it to be accessible to the officer so that he can just simply, when he's doing his safety inspection for his safety, to be able to access that information. And the best way for you to do that is by your having that in your trunk locked. Now, although the Supreme Court allows for law enforcement to be able to access the area where you're sitting in the vehicle and to do a pat down to make sure you don't have any weapons, it does not give them the authority to search the trunk of the vehicle unless they have established a probable cause to do so. So if you have your identifying paperwork, your license, your information in there in the trunk, then when they do that safety pat down, they still will not have any access to that information. So that's a second recommendation I have for you. Now, the third recommendation that I differ with Eddie Craig on is he recommends when the officer is acting in a belligerent manner that you ask for a supervisor. Now, I have seen many of these encounters go where individuals will ask for a supervisor because the individual that the individual officer they're dealing with right then and there is acting in a belligerent fashion, is, not doing uh, things in a way that makes them feel safe. So, my recommendation is that instead of asking the officer that you feel threatened and you're asking him for a supervisor, my recommendation is that you have, whether it be an additional cell phone or apart from your camera that's recording him or whatever, is have an additional cell phone available so that you can make a phone call to 911 as a non-emergency call and basically establish what you're doing is you're establishing a record. And so by calling 911, you can explain, listen, I've been pulled over by a police officer. I feel he is endangering my life, and I would require or request that you have the 911 operator send out a supervisor to the location because you feel that your life is in danger. If that's the way the officer is treating you, he is being aggressive and so forth. By doing this, you now have a record on the 911, the 911 call that you're feeling you're threatened, and you're establishing that what you're doing, your responses to the officer, you're doing it out of the fact that you're under duress, and so it helps establish that record. Now, if you chose not to do that with the 911 call, then at very least, you can call a friend or someone that will understand what you're doing and just ask them to stay on the call there and just put the call on speaker so that they can hear what's going on. And ultimately, that also gives you another witness to the scenario. So repeat everything that you're saying, like the officer's name, clearly so that whoever's you're calling on the other line can clearly hear that. So whether it's a 911 call you've made to request a supervisor respond to that encounter, or you're calling a friend or a family member, in that situation. I prefer the 911 call because ultimately what you're doing is you're able to get that audio recording of the 911 call. You're establishing a record that you feel threatened, and in the meantime they're making the recording and everything is being documented. And that's really the key. You want a separate entity that's not going to be like the police officer's buddy, especially if they're close buddies with their supervising officer. You know, many officers have and will lie for each other. So at least if you have an independent recording of what's going down through that 911 call, just, even if the officer says to put down the phone, but put it on speaker so that they can hear the transaction. And as much as you possibly can, do it in a way where they're going to be able to hear what's taking place. So these are my recommendations that are a little different than what Eddie Craig makes. Again, the first one was if the officers tell you to exit your vehicle, you exit, you don't delay. But of course, you invoke your rights. You vocally express that you are not giving any permission for search or seizure, but exit and follow the order of the officer. You, two, if you're going to be in your vehicle, make sure that before you even leave the driveway, first thing, all your paperwork in the trunk. This way, if you do get pulled over, then that officer cannot access that information until he establishes a probable cause. And if you want to go a little bit further with that, you could even have a suitcase that has the combination lock on it, so that suitcase can have all your paperwork in there, and you're establishing that your right to have your paperwork secure is one that he's going to have to establish. He's going to have to get a warrant for accessing any paperwork and so forth like that. So he's got to establish that probable cause. Otherwise, any information that he takes that he doesn't have a justified cause to access is what is called fruit of the poisonous tree. It would be not admissible in a court of law. And so that is my recommendation. That's my second recommendation. And of course, my third recommendation is if you're feeling threatened by the officer, call 911, explain you have an officer here that has pulled you over, you feel that he is threatening you, and that you are asking them to have a supervisor come to the scene. And again, all you're doing when you're doing that is you're establishing a record that you're not feeling safe, and it's establishing all the information that is there. Make sure when you make the call that you have whatever information you need from the officer, like his name and badge number, so that you can say those things. I have officer badge number so-and-so here. I feel he's threatening me and I don't feel safe. I would like you to have a supervisor come to the scene where I'm at. And ultimately they will act as an extra go-between, if you will, in the encounter. Now, If you don't wish to call 911, then what my other recommendation to you is then call a friend or family member that is going to understand what you're doing, and just have the phone on speaker and leave it so that they can hear the situation and let them know, hey, listen, I need you to be a witness to what's going on here. Just please listen in to the extent possible, and this way you have an additional witness which you can use as a to testify against the officer. So now you're not only recording the officer. That's one piece of evidence. You have an additional piece of evidence with the individual, whether it be the 911 operator or the family or friend member on the phone, as an additional witness of what was taking place. Because again, if you're relying on that supervisor's honesty, you may find that ultimately that supervisor, in most situations, is going to side with his other officer. So all you now have is another problem there to deal with. So these are my recommendations that are a little different than what Eddie Craig has recommended to you. I want to make it very crystal clear that I'm not an attorney, and this is not legal advice. This is me simply expressing to you what my opinions are as regards to circumstances such as this. And I don't work for any law enforcement, so ultimately, your decision to choose to use this advice, you have to weigh the circumstances, and you can certainly ask an attorney about what they feel about these recommendations as well. So, with that being said, please like and share this. I really do appreciate any thumbs up. And with that, I'm going to leave it here and say to you, God bless you and take care.